Welcome to this, I think, fourth lesson within the series of 18 lessons that make up the Sage CRM developer training cycle. We're going to be looking today at one of two lessons that covers the implementation of business rules within the context of the Sage CRM interface. And we're going to be thinking about specifically create scripts. These are Windows-based or screen-based rules. And we'll be considering as part of that really the question of context and understanding how context builds as we move through the system and the context that is available to us to allow us to define different types of business rule. So that's the basic set of what we want to look at today, and you can see that it is fitting into this larger cycle of training, and everything is designed to build on everything else that we've looked at so far. So as we talk through and understand the nature of coding within the screens, it is ultimately going to need us to remember back and think about our learning around the data model and the way in which Sage CRM uses views to be able to really establish the information that is available within any particular context inside the interface. Specifically for today, though, we're going to look and consider the different types of business rules that exist within Sage CRM. This is admittedly a theoretical thing, but we are going to look at the specific scripts that we write. So different types of rules, the different types of scripts. We'll think about the development tips as we go through, but the main objective to this is so that you can understand the power of the create script and its limitations, and to then be able to get going with creating business rules with the create scripts. So let's look then at the types of business rules that are available. The business rules within the interface for Sage CRM fall into four broad categories. The first and the easiest to understand for anyone is what's called an informative rule. An informative rule is simply the rule that puts a message onto the screen, like you must do this, or you cannot do this, or this is an option for you to do this. That is an informative rule. And you can see that then that informative rule is coupled with other types of actions that the business rules could theoretically take as we explore the coding options inside the Sage CRM interface. The first is a restrictive rule. This is a constraint that will stop us doing something. It blocks an action. Most typically, it will block the saving of data into the system. The next is a type of rule called a corrective rule. And a corrective rule will accept the data that you're putting, but it will change it on the way in. So if you've written something in lowercase and it needs to be uppercase, it will correct it to be an uppercase example of the data. And then the last type of rule, which is very often not coupled with any informative behavior, is something called a manipulative rule. And a manipulative rule is a way of cascading a change within the system. So this is the example, as the text says, it's an automatic change to data triggering of other behavior without prompting. An example of that might be is if you change the account manager for a company inside the interface, it will automatically cascade the change to the account manager for the underlying cases and opportunities so that they also change straight away. So you have there four different types of broad business rules that you can define inside the Sage CRM interface. I'm going to start looking at this and seeing examples of these in action. So here you can see that I've logged on into Sage CRM, and this is just a word of warning. we are going to have to move quite quickly through a lot of this topic. So as I go through, if you blink, you may miss it. So it's going to be quite important to review this lesson once it's published inside the Sage Support and Training YouTube channel. So as we look here, you can see I've logged on into Sage CRM. I'm logged on as the system administrator, and I'm navigating now to go into a company that I already have to find inside the system. This is Eurolandia, and we can see that, well, if we click to make a change, so I'm going to look at the idea of editing the screen. I'm going to highlight to some of the fields. So these are some of the fields. Now, these are examples of restrictive rules. Now, not all restrictive rules are rules which require any coding. But here you can see that a restrictive rule is all about stopping a user doing something that would break the logic of the system or the data requirements of the system. You'll notice that the company name is required. This is a mandatory field. It's a type of restriction that is defined within Sage CRM entirely as a codeless option. Now, you can't, if I was to delete the company name and try and save it, I wouldn't be able to commit. So it would be completely restrictive in my behavior. You'll notice also there's a company type field. Now, the company type field is restricted to only certain values. So the field is optional, but once a value is entered, it has to conform to the allowed values. And this is another form of constraint or restriction on the user's behavior. And the last option in this triumvirate of options is to look at the company account manager field, and this is a lookup. Now, again, this field is not mandatory, but if a value is entered, there has to be a match to the underlying user table. So this is another form of restrictive rule, which in this case is enforcing referential integrity. So all types of rules, these are restrictive rules in action. Now here, I've just clicked on the case list and I've selected one of the cases belonging to Eurolandia. And I'm going to switch this now into edit mode. And in this screen, I will highlight two other fields. I'll just bring those to your attention. Now, neither of these, now notice here, neither of these fields are mandatory. But if I put a value on the SLA field, you can see that I've just marked this as gold in that field, and then attempt to save, you can see that something has happened to block that commitment. So there's that commit within the database has been blocked, and a message has been displayed on the screen. And you'll notice that in this case, what has happened is that there is a type of restriction that is stretching across two separate fields. This tells you that restrictive rules are not just within the scope of the single field, but restrictive rules can look at what is here an intra-row restriction. So we're not allowed to do something which is within the single row of a database table attempting to be saved into the database. But by extension, you could probably start to imagine that you're also understanding that you can have inter-row restrictions as well. You can start to imagine that you could block certain actions as well, depending on existing data in other rows and even within other tables. So restrictions of the data can be quite sophisticated and to guard the behavior of the user, to constrain them to only certain types of behavior. Well, let's have a look at the admin screens and see where this particular example within the case entry box long has been defined. So you can see I've come into administration. And I'm going to come now into customization. I'm navigating into cases and then into the screens tab to drill down into the case details screen. The particular field that I want to look at is the case severity field. And if we look here, you can see that a validate rule has been defined. Now, we're going to be looking mainly in this lesson at create scripts. We'll be understanding that one of the limitations of create scripts is that it can't block database actions. But validate rules very much are all about blocking the interaction with the database. But you'll notice that in this particular case, the restriction is within a validation rule. It's the most common form of expression of a restrictive rule, but there are other types of restrictions. As I said, we saw codeless examples just a moment ago. Let's go back and look at the next type of rule. So if you looked at restrictions, let's have a look here at a corrective rule. Now I'm going to show you a very simple corrective rule by looking at the address tab. I've come into the listing of addresses for this particular company, and I'm going to look down at this individual address field. Now, the field that I want to look at is postcode. It might be called zip code in your implementation, but it is where you would put the zip or the postal code for the address. Now, if this is default behavior within Sage CRM, if I come down in here and put in some text into the field in mixed case, and I move off the field to trigger the on change event, you can see that it has now been correctly capitalized to force everything into uppercase. And again, this is a type of behavior that is occurring to change the data to make it to conform to a pattern that is expected within the database. Now we can see where this is done. If we look back into administration and look into the secondary entities and go to the address and then onto the address screen, I can come down into the address box long. And the field that I want to show you is the postcode field. And you can see that this has an on-change script associated with it. So we've seen where a validate rule is very often associated with restrictions. Here, the on-change is very often associated with the idea of a correction to the data being used. And it's correcting the data before it is submitted, not as it's being submitted. So it's correcting it within the browser. As we develop the concept of corrective rules, I will have to show you how you can add another layer of security within the context of the table level scripts to ensure that any data that needs to be changed to conform to a particular pattern can actually be checked within the context of or shaped within the context of the on change, but it can also be changed within a table level script executed within the server. So two locations where you can implement a rule. And this is where we start to think about how all of these rules start to interact. So there's complexity here. As we start to look at the definition of business rules within Sage CRM, we're going to see that there are rules that we can express in the context of the screen, and that screen is going to be managing the HTTP request response cycle. As we look at the screen, as it submits data, we're going to think about how things appear within the screen as it's created and the individual fields are created within the screen. We'll look at how a user makes a change to an edit screen, which is then submitted. And we'll see the options there of the on change within the individual field, the commitment of the data within the context of the screen. And once this is our focus for this lesson and next lesson, but as we develop this idea of the lessons, we have to understand that those screens themselves fall into the overall pattern of carrying out actions against a table. And consequently, we will also have to think about the actions of inserting a record, updating a record, and perhaps deleting a record as well. So we'll have also some other options to define what could be a restriction or could in fact be further manipulation or correction of the data. The individual screens themselves may fall within different business processes, and we will also, as we develop over these 18 lessons, some ideas about how workflow, both user-driven workflow, the behaviors that as actors within the system choose to do something within the interface, drives a workflow process onwards. We'll see how we can moderate our screens at that point, change the behavior of those screens, and we'll also see how time is an actor within the system as well. And we have escalation rules, which are also imposing behavior and managing behavior of those different types of rules, either to correct or to manipulate the data. So we'll be looking at that. But let's roll back and make our life a little bit simpler just by thinking about what we're looking at here in a screen. And so as we look at a screen, either something like the address box long screen, which I showed you, or the company box long screen, this is starting to show us how everything fits together. We have an interface that has to arrive in the form of HTML inside the browser, the definitions of which are stored inside the database as metadata, and it's the metadata that determines the behavior of each of the fields that we will see on the screen. We will then know that if we click on a particular hyperlink or a button, we are generating an HTTP request from the browser to the web server. Sage CRM has to respond. The eWordDLL responds by starting to assemble the HTML that will be returned to the screen. The first thing that it does is it has to create all of the fields that will sit inside that screen. So this is where we meet the idea of the create scripts, the on-change scripts, and the validate scripts within the screen. So the first type are the create scripts, which draw and change the behavior of the individual fields. We can then start to look at the idea of submitting data into the system and validating it. And we can even think about how we change the data as we are working with inside the screen. So we've got the behavior of these fields changed at different points. So validation is behavior that is executed within the server. On create, we see the fields generating the product in the browser, and on change is executed entirely within the browser. All this then is that makeup of just part of the complexity that is the Sage CRM script interactions framework. It's a very rich environment, and it gives us all these different options to be able to control exactly what we want to do with the data for the user interface. So let's have a look at how we start to use this. Now, part of the behavior of everything that we look at is how it all fits in to workflow, table level scripts, time-based, everything, all those notifications, they all interact with the same database. Now, we're not looking at those today. We just don't have the time to consider them. They're building up gradually into all of these different scripting points. And because the script is fired at different places, so a create script is executed on the server as the screen is being generated to be displayed in the screen, you can understand that the objects within the server are going to be different from being in the browser. In the case of the individual fields, the individual fields are assembled and invoked one by one. And so one by one, those individual fields have a create script that is fired, but doesn't know anything else about any other field at that moment. It doesn't know what other fields are declared inside the screen that is being invoked. When it comes to the on change scripts, they take place entirely inside the browser, and so we're using the document object model of the browser. You've got things like the navigator and the location objects, which you just don't have available to you in the create script. But likewise, you'll have variables that are unique to the create script and methods to the create script, because where you are writing it has a different class environment, same language, JavaScript, but different objects available to you. And the same goes with validation scripts and table level scripts. You're working with different contexts, and so the objects and methods and properties that you can use are going to be different, because you are writing in a different place. And by extension, you can understand that the environment that you write in, if you are writing an extension of the interface using the classic ASP pages, or you are creating a call with the self-service interface, they are working again in yet another environment to provide different classes and or rather objects, properties and methods. So depending on whether you're writing internal or external, you've got different objects available to you. That's where we have this idea of the scope of reference and the scope of effect. And sometimes you'll see this inside the blog articles that have been written on the Sage Community Hub. We'll talk about, as we are writing any business rules inside, say, the create script, we will need to think about what are the objects available to me? What system data can I access at this point? And what environmental data can I access? That's the scope of reference. The scope of effect would be what can I change in terms of the properties of the object that I'm in, or what data can I change for the data that is going to be submitted into the database or eventually processed. Each context provides you with different objects which have their own methods and classes, the methods and properties. Here you can see that if you are writing in the context of a create script, you can use certain objects like the main CRM object with the create query object, create record, a lot of data manipulation tasks that you can carry out in terms of the objects. And you also have access as well to some additional system variables that I'll talk about as we develop the training. Now, whenever we're writing the business rules inside Sage CRM and scripting, we're only ever using JavaScript. JavaScript is used for create script, validate script at the field level. You can use, within the context of the on-change script, you could use libraries of JavaScript that are provided, such as jQuery or other client-side libraries, which are also referenced inside the interface. But generally speaking, will be in the examples I'll be giving you, I will be mostly plain old JavaScript. Or in the case of the client side, I will use the client side API that we have had, which is a simplified version of jQuery for us, which is aimed at the objects that we have inside the Sage CRM interface. JavaScript is used implicitly for on-change scripts. You don't need to declare the scripting language being used. Now I've changed back into Sage CRM. I'm going to go back and think about URLs. So you'll notice that I've dropped CRM out of being maximized, and you can see that I'm now looking at navigating through a different context. So here I'm now looking at the opportunities tab for a company, and I can drill down into an opportunity, and the URL at the top of the screen is changing. So the URL is changing as the context that we're in, until finally we're looking at the communications under an individual opportunity, until I look at an individual task that has been defined inside the system. I'm looking at an individual communication, and suddenly I see a very large amount of contextual information displayed within inside the browser. Now, if I show you this, the URL is complex, but it can be broken down to understand the context that is available. Now, this is important to get, because when you're writing business rules, you will need to think in terms of what are my scope of reference and what is my scope of effect. My scope of a reference is very often going to be things like, what is my context? Where am I? And here you can see that context is determined by the name value pairs that are passed in as the parameters. In this particular case, you can see that I've got things like key -1 equals 1, key 0 equals 7, key 1 equals 28, key 2 equals 30. I've even got a key 6 equals 94, and key 7 equals 6. Now I can read that. I can read that and tell that I'm looking at key 0, which is 7. So I am looking at a communication, and I can see that the communication here is key 7 equals 6. So I'm looking at a particular context. And if I develop this still further, I can read through and see that key 1 is 28, and I happen to know that key 1 is always going to be the company information, and key 2 is always going to be the person information. So I have the unique identifiers for many different records that sit inside the CRM system. I can read that context and know what this is about. Now you can think of context as you log on as building like a snowball. One of the first things, so it builds as you navigate through the system. The context is always passed inside the URL. The session ID, which sits inside the URL, is implicitly providing the user context. The ID, the session ID can be matched internally with CRM to know who has logged on into the system. It has to know that in order to be able to set the appropriate rights for the user. And if you remember back, we know that there's a tie-in from the users logging on into security and how the security is implemented by changing any of the SQL that is generated with inside the user interface. So there's a lot of synchronization as to who logged on user is and the SQL that is generated against the database. But I've got all of this current context, the company, the person, the communication, and the opportunity, all gradually builds as I move through the interface, working out where I am. You'll always, though, know who has logged on and the main entity that is currently being viewed. If we look again at this, key 0, you sometimes see written and called the dominant key. That's the main current context. Key 1, the company. Key 2, the person. Key 6, I got it wrong. Key 6 is the communication. Key 7 is the opportunity. I should have remembered that, my bad. So key 7 is the opportunity. Key 6 is the communication. I know exactly what is being looked at that moment. Now, I also know, because of the session ID, who's logged on, and because of that, there's a whole host of information that is available within inside the script. This is the scope of reference to be able to access about the current logged on user. So I can access the display name. I can work out which team they belong to, which security territory they're part of. I can see if there's anything else set about that particular user. And this current user object exists both within inside the server side, available for create scripts and validate scripts, but also it exists inside the client, so it's available to on-change script and other client-side coding. We'll develop that idea in the next lesson. Because we can access the current user object, we can start to write our first simple script using this idea of the user as the main context. So here you can see that I'm using the current user object. There's also a system variable called valid and another one called error string. They're a pair. If ever valid as a system variable is set to be false, then whatever is the contents of the error string will be written out. It starts to become a very useful tool for debugging and just checking to understand what context that you're in. So this script will check what team the current user is in, and if they are not in the sales team, then an error will be thrown deliberately and the error message will be then written onto the screen, as we can see here. So this is where I'm adding that script into the company name field in the company box long screen. You can see it's defined as a create script there. When it's used, so when I look at the company summary screen, because I'm logged on as the system administrator, and the system administrator is in the team operations, not in sales, the system administrator gets the message "Hello World" as the rule was defined. Now, the message displays in both view mode and edit mode. So it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the summary screen, the edit screen, or the insert screen. The create scripts run as the metadata from the screen is assembled. You can detect the mode. There are techniques to do this to determine exactly when you want something to be displayed. But by default, if you've not managed and looked to the context of whether your screen is in edit mode, it would be running. And so that is whenever the screen is requested in whatever mode. And here you can see that if I click save, you'll notice that the create script has not interrupted the commit process. So this is important to understand, that create scripts do not block saves going into the database. So one of the things that you won't use the create scripts for is for anything other really than an informative message telling the user about something or changing the properties of the fields. You won't be able to block the screen committing the data. That would have to be done through a validation rule. We can, though, start to see how an informative rule can be paired potentially with another rule that we'll see later on. So this is an example of where we can declare a rule that acts as a warning. In this particular case, we can start to see that this is reference the company, and if we don't have a service level agreement, it's going to tell us that we can't actually go ahead and create that case until we have defined a service level agreement. So this is all about preventing people or warning people that they shouldn't try and create a case when the customer doesn't have a service level agreement. So as we look here, what you can see is that I've taken that script and I've added it to the create script within the case detail box against the case reference ID field. In practice, this is what it will look like. You can see when a user starts to create a new case for a company, the message will warn that user that they're just about to run into a problem. The same script can be also used in the validate script to actually block the final commitment of the record. But as I said, we'll look at that down at the next lesson. There are other ways that you could have done this. You could have hidden the ability to start to create a new case record. We'll see this as we start to think about workflow, because the workflow has a condition associated with it that causes a button or decides when a button appears or not, a workflow button. And you could have a workflow rule that says the new case button simply will not appear in the context of a company that does not have a service level agreement. So there's more than one way of implementing a particular rule to prevent inappropriate data being added into the system. All of the objects that I've discussed so far are, of course, documented. You can check out the documentation on help.sagecrm.com. Inside the reference here, you'll need to go to the reference area and look at the names of the different blocks. You will see that they are like the fields where create scripts are entered are called entry blocks. And that will contain all of the properties, all of the methods are appropriate at this point. Let's take this a little bit further. We can check the documentation, we can see all the properties for an individual field. I'm going to remind you that there is this idea of the scope of reference and the scope of effect. The scope of reference allows you to look at what is in context. For a create script, what is in context is general information about the user, so the current user object, general information about the system, and then specific information about its own field. But it doesn't know about any other field that is contained within the screen, because the context in which the create scripts are run is only in the context of the individual screen, individual field. So they're not run in the context of the overall screen. They are run as the field is created into the final package that will be sent to the browser. We can change the default value of a field. We can set, when you come to writing, inserting a data, we can change things. We can change, we can look to the idea whether we hide or we change the field to be read-only, based on contextual information. Now, if we have got information about the general system and we have the user information, actually we can be pretty clever about this, because it gives us the freedom to be able to look anywhere within the database to check any data that we like. Earlier on, I talked about the idea of how rules can look to data that is within the same record or within existing data within inside the system, and create scripts, because they can use methods like the find record to be able to look through. You can go and check the values in other tables and other rows to be able to write rules which are effectively inter-table and intra-table rules. But before we develop those sorts of ideas, let's think about the circumstances why you might need to check the value of other information. This is the case service level agreement ID field, so SLA ID field. I'm looking here at the authorization properties, the security properties, to be able to see that I can set a rule at this point as to which users can both view this information and edit this information. But what you'll notice here is that it is only about the user. What if you wanted to be able to express a rule that looks at information that is beyond the individual user, or beyond their team, or beyond even the security profile? What if you wanted to check to see whether the company itself was in a particular situation? What if I wanted to check to see the parental company was in a particular situation? So I want to be able to set a rule on this field that says, well, what if? And that rule is this: only support team members may change a company SLA field when the company is of type customer. Now, the codeless mechanism that we saw, I could actually say only support team members can change a company SLA field. But I can't do it in a codeless way if I want to add in the and, which is when the company is of type customer. That has to be something that I have to code for. We can only implement this with field level scripting. And it's going to look a little like this. Here you can see, and this is where we're introducing the ability to look to the context that we're in. So the create script can use this crm.getContext method to say, read the URL, and for the company related information, get the company type. Now that's not contained in the URL. What happens here is it will know that we are interested in the current company in context. It will then write a select statement to the database and hand it back, and that will retrieve the type field that we're interested in as the return value, which gets written into the variable, in this case, string type. So I can check this in my if statement. I can combine it with a check on the current user object that we've met before. So user underscore primary channel ID is equivalent to 3, and the string type is equivalent to customer. If that's the case, then read-only is false, so you can actually edit it, but else it is read-only equals true, so it becomes something that can't be edited when the company is not a customer, or when the person is not in the support team. We've introduced here, we've started to look at a range of different things. We've looked at the idea of some of the variables already, but as we start to develop concepts to be able to do work, we're going to be meeting other methods that can be used to return contextual information into our scripts. Things like values, form values, and we want to be able to do different activities such as reading what is in the URL directly, or whether we want to be able to change data that is then submitted to the database. And different things can do different tasks. We're going to be meeting and using values, form values, as we go through, because we want to read what's going on inside a screen. They're much more to do with validation and table level scripts, but there's still something that we need to understand here, because we can start to read the information within the URL. So a values method allows us to read a URL and access the key values. The action code is one of those. The mode is another little flag that can sometimes be very useful for us to know about, so we can determine exactly the correct circumstances to trigger the code. Now I'm going to take some of this idea and look at some tricks that we can use with our create scripts. So look here at where I've come into the company table, and I've created a field called dummy. Now, dummy is simply a text field. It's a text field which has a length of 1 and an entry length of 1, and nobody is expected to be able to ever enter anything into this field. I'm using this as a mechanism to be able to hack the interface. Now, it's a legitimate hack because this is a field that exists in here that I can now add to a screen. This particular screen, this particular field that I'm adding into the company top content screen, and taking advantage of the fact that my scope of reference is that I can work out my context, and I can read the context, write questions to the database to be able to return information into the interface. Now I'm using the caption property of the field to be the target of the HTML that I'm generating, so I replace what would be the title of a field with the text that I want. The particular example that I'm looking at generates a return to allow me to come into a particular field, into a particular company record, and I can see straight away that the number of opportunities and the number of cases associated with this company is declared on the top right. So those are the current cases in operation. How that's done is not particularly hard. It's not complex, but it introduces us to this idea that the scope of reference can be much larger than simply knowing who the current user is and which current record is, because you can then go and find some other bits of information anywhere within the database. So here you can see that the script is doing it's doing a find record against the opportunities. Now remember, this is written in the context of the company. So it's going to retrieve all records from the company where the opportunity status is in progress and the Oppo primary company ID is equal to, and there you can see we're doing a get context to get hold of the company ID. So we're building a query string that goes off to the database and returns, in this case, all of the opportunity records for this company. The same for the case as well. We then build the caption, which will be the output value, and you'll notice here that we're also building URLs that if we were to click on the URL, it would take us to the opportunity list or to the case list. And if you see as well that once we've got that set of opportunity records back and that case records back, we can count. We can just use a property from that object to say what's the record count, to build in the answer that is then displayed within the interface. All straightforward, but it does mean that a very simple type of rule suddenly is not just about telling the user when they're just about to go wrong, or telling the user something that they knew already, like they are the logged on user. It can be used to derive other information and then display it into the interface. Now we can take this idea of a dummy field still further to make completely new behavior inside Sage CRM. For example, here you can see that I've changed the nature of the field to be able to show an image field inside the screen. That could have been a photograph. It could have been whatever I need it to be. And this has been done by allowing a file to be uploaded into the library, an image file to be uploaded into the library that is then automatically assumed to be associated with the person to be displayed. And this is a dummy field trick. I happen to have called this dummy field pers_person image. It gives me the ability to display the field and include the field directly in my person box long, to then write a script that will change the behavior of the field. So it becomes something that just displays the user. And here you can see, again, it's a bit of JavaScript. It's not too long. It's a bit longer, but it's not much harder. If you want to look at this, how you can use this particular example, we've written an example. You can download it from the Sage CRM community. So that's community.sagecrm.com. You can go to the download section, and the thing that you want to look for is the component display image in a person summary. And it's been tested for 2023 R2. You should be able to load that, look at that, and understand how a create script like that can work. Now, create scripts aren't just used within the screens. They're used within lists as well. They can be used in very interesting ways. So you can write, and the example here is inside the opportunity list. The opportunity list includes automatically the name of the company. But if you think about the context of where an opportunity list is displayed, that could be displayed in the context of the My CRM user context, or in the team CRM context, but it can also be displayed in the context of the company and the person. But if you're already in the context of the company and the person, you know what the company is. So the company name column becomes, in those circumstances, redundant. And this is a script that can be added onto that column to remove from display the particular field if it's in context. So you don't need to display it, you don't need to tell people that you've got lots and lots of gate comms opportunities associated with GateCom when you're looking at GateCom and its list of opportunities. Have a look at the options for this when you start to take this lesson and explore the materials on the Sage Community Hub, the blog articles, and of course, the downloads from the Sage CRM community. We're going to be developing this idea of context, developing the idea of how everything fits together in our next lesson, which is looking at developing the idea of the on-change and the validate scripts. So do have a look at those. Let's see at this point whether anyone has got any questions.